Baruch Hashem. Today's daf yomi is Shevuos Tafei Shevuos 5, and we're going to start on 5a, 11 lines from the top. That the Gemara says Gufa. Where introduces the words Gufa always introduce a topic that was discussed earlier, and this was something that was discussed on Dalet Amabeis. Minayin she'ino chayav elal sheyesh ba'yidiyah b'tchila v'yidiyah b'sof v'hela b'intayim. How do we know? How do we know that you're only going to be liable for Tumas Mikdash V'Kadashav if for something that you had knowledge from at the beginning, knowledge at the end, and in the middle you had a halama, you had a concealment of the fact. So Tamulamar V'Nelam V'Nelam Shnei Pamim Divrei Rebbe Akiva. So Rebbe Akiva says that the words V'Nelam that appear in the pasuk twice in relation to this type of Tumah Mikdash teaches us that you need a yediyah at the beginning and also yediyah at the end, the talam in the middle. Whereas Rebbe Omer Einot Tzarach, Rebbe says no, we don't need V'Nelam to teach us that because it says V'Nelam. From the fact that it says V'Nelam, it teaches us Miklal Shehu Yada, that he had a yediyah. And then there it says V'Hu Yada. And then it says V'Hu Yada, which means, excuse me, Areikan Shtei Yediyos. So that's where we're going to Shtei Yediyos. So the two knowledges. So why did it say V'Nelam twice? And this is a dispute between Rebbe and Rebbe Akiva. And came out Tamulamar V'Nelam. Why did it say V'Nelam a second time? So says the Gemara, L'chayev al Helam Tumah al Mikdash, that Rebbe, unlike Rebbe Akiva, says you're going to be liable not only for Tumas Mikdash, entering the temple in a state of Tumah, but also for eating the Kodesh in a state of Tumah. That's what the V'Nelam is teaching us about this carbon oil biorin. And so therefore, that's the position of Rebbe, who argues with Rebbe Akiva on that. So the Gemara now analyzes this statement that the word V'Nelam, according to Rabbi Akiva, implies that he knew about it already. And Nelam, according to Rabbi, means that he knew about it already. So says the Gemara, Amar Mar, V'Nelam Mikol Sheyada. That means he knew about it. My mashma, how do we know? What's the source of this idea that V'Nelam means that you knew about something already? So Amar Rava, Midloksiv V'Hi Aluma Mimenu. From the fact that it doesn't say that he had never known, which would have been the statement of Aluma Mimenu. So this teaches us, and the fact that it doesn't use that type of language, we see from here that it means that he had knowledge and then he forgot it, because aluma menu means he never had knowledge. So nela means he had knowledge, but he forgot it. So Amroy Abaye, El Meata Gabe Sota. Well, let's go to the case of a Sota. We know a Sota is a man warns his wife she's not allowed to be secluded. And if she then goes ahead and is secluded with another man, and he goes and tests her with the bitter waters. But these bitter waters, according to Gemara and Sota, it's only a proper test if the man himself is innocent of sin as well. So it says with respect to a Sota that it states, Vinela Meine Isha, it says there also that she was concealed from the eyes of her husband, meaning to say her sin was concealed. That's the way most understand it. He didn't know that she was already adulterous. That proves that if, according to you, Manela means he had knowledge initially. And so if that's the case, if he had knowledge initially, and then Rashi understands that the ukimta is here, that after she was secluded, he went ahead and was then with his wife, which is prohibited. So if that's the case, the waters would never have been able to test her. But we know that the waters can test her, which means that he never had prior knowledge. As it states, and the man will be free of sin, and this woman will carry her sin, which means only when a man is free from his sin will the waters inspect his wife. But if the man is not free of sin, then the waters don't inspect the wife. So we see from here So we see from here that Venelam does not mean a knowledge from the beginning. It means he never had knowledge. And furthermore, the Gemara says another example, a poetic example, the Sugabe Torah, with respect to the knowledge of the Torah. It says, it was concealed from every living creature, and from the birds of the heaven, it was hidden. God's ways, basically, the ways of the Torah. If you want to say V'na'ama means that there was knowledge initially of it, you mean to say that people had that the creatures of the world initially had knowledge of the Torah? How could that be? Nobody, no man knows the full expanse of the Torah. The Torah is infinite. So therefore, Abaye is of the position when Rebbe says V'na'am means it means he had knowledge. It doesn't mean that he had direct knowledge. When Rebbe says V'na'am, that means to say, remember we said above that that he had knowledge. It doesn't mean he had direct knowledge. It means Yediyah space Rabo Shema Yediyah. Rebbe's at the position that when he knew about it in his yeshiva, when he studied, he went to the cheder and he studied about the laws of korban olav yored, and he understood the law that if you enter into the base of mikdash when you're tamei, you have to accidentally bring a korban olav yored. That's considered knowledge. And then he entered into the courtyard of the temple. What's the yukim? To hear Rashi tells us, Shelama bebeis Rabo. I'm reading from the Rashi. He learned in his Rebbe's house. Shanogeya betumo tame. He learned from the Rebbe. He learned in the yeshiva that somebody who touches tuma becomes tame. Hu yada shehirgish kishenaga, and he knew that he touched something that was tame. So he had a knowledge. So then, why is it accidental? Lo hitbonein lasum alibo shenitma, but and he didn't know. He didn't pay attention to put it all together. Lasum alibo, to put it all together. He knew that there's this concept of tuma. He knew he was tame, but he didn't. He wasn't able to make the connection, to pay attention, and to realize, oh, now I can't go into the base of mikdash. He had yediyah space Rabo. And that's called Yediyah, but he also has the Halama. So Abaye says, what about the Mishnah says that if he has no Yediyah at the beginning, but he has Yediyah at the end, the Mishnah has that Ukimta, that which it said in our Mishnah, that if he hasn't, that he needs Yom Kippur to come and be a kapar because he had no knowledge at the beginning, but only at the end, eventually. So Yom Kippur was Toah. If that's the case, ask the Gemara, Mi'ika do Esla Yediyah space Rabo. How is it possible that he didn't have this type of Yediyah at the beginning? Is there anybody in the world who didn't sit in the yeshiva and learn the laws of Tumah? Of course, he would have sat there in first grade and learned that that you're not allowed to enter into the base of Mikdash when you're Tumah. How could you ever have such a situation? That's what Papa asks Abaye. So Abaye responds, of course you can. Normally in Mishkachas al-Rahman we have such circumstance. It's called a tinok shenishba bein hanachim. That we have a child who was captured amongst there was a child who was captured and raised amongst the idolaters. Only such a child would never have never been able to establish himself in the yeshiva and learn the halachos of Tumah. But other people would have for sure learned it. But not everybody says that this is lavdaka. Sometimes the Gemara wants to give us this explanation with soaring poetry, and so the Gemara assumes that every Jew will, of course, know the halachos unless you're captured and raised amongst the nacham. This is the idea of tinok shenishal bein nacham. That's the only excuse we have for not understanding the full gamut of the Torah. So then the Mishnah listed the two that are four. On to the next category. Yitzios Shabbos or Shtayim Shein Arba. The Yitzios Shabbos, who are about to start a new piece, two on the second white line on 5a. The Yitzios of Shabbos are Shtayim Shein Arba. Good morning, Jeff. Boker Tov. The prohibitions of Shabbos are also of carrying on Shabbos are two that are four. That's our category of our Mishnah. Our Mishnah listed what are the two that are four. The Shevuos Shtayim Shein Arba. The oaths are two that are four. The Yedios Atumah are two that are four. the Yitzios Shabbos are two that are four, and the Maros and the Goyim are two that are four. So now the carrying on Shabbos are two that are four. Remember when we explained the Gemara, when we explained the Mishnah, we followed Rashi, and Rashi says what we're talking about here is what are the two that are four? The first two is the person is standing inside the private domain, Rishus HaYachid, and the Baal HaBayis, and he hands it out to the poor man who's in the Rishus HaRabim. And the other one is that a person who's poor reaches his hand into the private domain and takes the object out to the public domain. Those are two, taking it from the private domain to the public domain. And then we said the four is when is taking it from the public domain into the private domain, meaning to say that the poor man takes his object and brings it and passes it into the private domain, or poor man reaches his hand into the private domain and takes it out. So the two that are four are two of Rishus HaYachid and two of Rishus HaRabim. So now the Gemara says, but what about the Mishnah in Shabbos? Tanan Hasam, we went to the Mishnah in Shabbos. Yitzio Shabbos Shtayim Shein Arba Bifnim, Mishtayim Shein Arba B'chutz. It's actually two that are four inside and two that are four outside. What does that mean? So there they have in Shabbos. If we add it up, we get to 8. So Rashi says, Shtayim L'chiyuv Achnasa. There are two to obligate you about bringing it in, about the poor man. V'achnasa the Baal HaBayis. So if either the poor man brings it in or the Baal HaBayis sticks his hand down and brings it in. Ubeis liftor. And how do we have the two that are exempt? In order for you to be liable for the carbon, you need to do both what's called the akira and anacha. You need to lift it up and place it down. So both those two cases, if you did only half the job, you're not going to be liable for a carbon. So therefore, we're in Shabbos, there are two that you're liable for and two that you're exempt. That's the two that are four, not that you're liable in all four cases. And and there are two that you're liable for from the public domain into the private domain, and there are two that you're exempt. So the Gemara says the question, how come over here we have the same expression, two that are four, but it means something different? So how come over here we have two that are four and that's it? We don't have two that are four inside and two that are four outside. And there it says two that are four inside and two that are four outside. So we veered. So the Gemara says, Hasam the Ikar Shabbos. So okay, so the Gemara explains there we're talking about the essence of Shabbos. So therefore, Tani of Avos v'Tolados. It says not only the Avos, which are, what is Avos and Tolados? You remember we started at the beginning of Avakam, we had a whole question what Avos and Tolados mean. It's not really, doesn't mean the same thing throughout the Shas. Avos, Rashi says, mean Yitzios, taking it out. We'll see what the word Yitzia means in a few moments, taking it out, and Tolados are taking them in. So the Yitzios are explicit in the Torah, and the Tolados are not explicit in the Torah. So therefore, in the case of Shabbos, since it's the essence, it's the essential source of it. Therefore, it says that avos and tolados. Hachadolav ikar Shabbosu. Here, since it's not the essential aspect of essential place to discuss Shabbos, avos tani tolados lo tani. That's the Gemara's first answer. So we're just limiting it to the avos, not the tolados. Now, I explained the Gemara according to the Maskana, according to the conclusion. So the Gemara has to get there, it builds it up. So the Gemara's first assumption is here we're only talking about the case in Shevuos, only talking about the Avos, the Yitzios, and not the Tolados or also the Achnatsos. The Gemara says, Avos, wait 1 second. My Ninu, what are these Avos Yitzios? That there are, so they are the taking out, they are the Yitzios. There's only two of them. Yitzios Tarte Havyan. There's only two of the Yitzios. Meaning to say, what are the two Yitzios? Where the Baal HaBayis is standing in and he brings the object outside and places it there, or the poor man is standing outside and brings it inside. He sticks his hand inside and takes it out to the public domain. There are only two Yitzios. So why do we say there are four? And if you want to say that there are two to say you're liable, that if you take it, if the Baal HaBayis takes it and brings it outside, or if the poor man reaches in and brings it out, and those are the two that are liable. And then the two that are exempt, Rashi tells us, one is where the poor man sticks his hand inside and the Baal Bayis sticks it into it, and then the poor man takes it out because the poor man does not do the lifting up directly. He doesn't do the akira. Uh, and 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 the other one is where the Baal Bayis sticks his hand outside and the poor man takes it from it. So if you want to say there are two that you're liable for and two that you're exempt, but it can't be. But dumya demaros nigayim katani, because the next case in the Mishnah says that when it comes to tsaras, which we call maros nigayim, the affliction, the appearances of the affliction, there it's two that are four, and there it has to be similar case. Masam kul chiyuve, just like there, all four cases are you're liable. Afacha kul chiyuve. Also here, the two that are four, you have to be liable. Elam Rav Papa, so Rav Papa gives a different answer. Hasam, the Ikar Shabbos, there in that case, it's the essential laws of Shabbos. Tani chiyuve upeture. So therefore, it's more elaborate. It lists all the cases where you're liable and also the cases where you're exempt. Hacha chiyuve tani upeture lo tani. Here, in our case, it only lists where you're liable, but it doesn't list the cases where you're exempt. So it doesn't list the cases where you didn't do both an akira and hanacha. Chiyuve ma'inenu. What are the chiyuvim? The chiyuvim are the yitzios, where you take it out, which we just said, where the poor man sticks his hand in and brings it out, and where the Baal Bayis picks it up and brings it out. But yitzios targudavyon. So the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, if we're going to say what are the chiyuvim? These are the yitzios. Yitzios tarti udavim. These yitzios, there are only two, and our Mishnah says that yitzios of shtaim are four. So the Gemara says shtaim de hotzah, shtaim de achnasa. So the Mishnah says there are two that you're liable for hotzah, for taking it out from the public domain. One is the Baal Bayis, one is the poor man, and then you're two that you're liable for achnasa, taking it from the public domain into the private domain. Gemara says, how can you say there are two that are Otzah and two that are Achnasa? It says, Yitzios Shtayim are Shein Abra. It says the Yitzios. How Yitzios Ketani? You don't mention anything about Achnasa. Achnasa is taking it in. Yitzios is taking it out. So it says Rav Ashi, Amar Rav Ashi, Tana, Achnasa, Nami, Otzah, Karil. The Tana calls Achnasa also Otzah, meaning taking it into the public domain, he also calls taking it out, which it makes sense because you're taking it out from one domain, as the Gemara is going to explain, from one domain to the other. So the Gemara says, Mimai, how do we know this idea that the Tana will call bringing it into one domain, bringing it into the private domain from the public domain, will call that a Yitzia? The Tanan, and I'll prove it to you from the Mishnah in Shabbos, it says, Hamotzi mirishus l'rishus chayiv, that if you just take it out from one domain to another domain, meaning you take it out from the private domain to the public domain, or from the public domain to the private domain, you're going to be liable. Aren't we talking about a case where you're taking it from the public domain to the private domain? Rashi says that aren't we talking about this case where you bring it from the public domain into the private domain? That case also, and still we call it Otzah. So therefore we see that Otzah is also Achnasa. So the Gemara says, Dilma. So the Gemara says, but maybe the Gemara says maybe the Mishnah is only talking about a case. Maybe the Mishnah is not talking about a case where you bring it from the public domain into the private domain. It's only talking about a case where you bring it from the private domain into the public domain. And so therefore it calls it Yitzios. But if we're talking about a case of a person who brings it from the public domain into the private domain, it would call it Achnasa. How do we know that that Mishnah is talking, that Mishnah in Shabbos is talking about, maybe when it says Hamotzim Rishus or Rishus Chayav, maybe it's just talking about a case of somebody who brings it from the private domain into the public domain. Mar says, no, Imkain Nisnei Hamotzim Rishus Hayachar or Rishus Haram, because the Mishnah would have been more precise if it was only talking about that. It would have said that somebody brings it from the private into the public. My Rishus or Rishus. What do you mean when it says from the public, from one domain into another domain? Now, Rishus Harabim or Rishus Hayachid, even if you bring it from the public domain into the private domain, you're still going to be liable because Kari La Hutzah, and it's still called a Hutzah. So the Gemara says, V'taimamai. So now the Gemara asked the question, what's the reason why the Tana calls Achnasa Hutzah? Okay, fine. I understand. You proved that the Mishnah in Shabbos called bring it from the public domain into the private domain a yitzia, even though you're bringing it in, not bringing it out. So why does the Mishnah call hotza, call hachnasa hotza? The time am I? Tana call akiras chayfetz mimikomo hotza karilar. So he says the Tana calls anytime you lift up an object and take it away from its place, he calls it a hotza. So that's the concept. Amar Ravina Masnisin Nami Daika. Our Mishnah, you could also learn that Achnasa is called a Yitzia. That when it says Yitzios, it also refers to Achnasa. The Katani Yitzios Shtayim Shein Arba Bifnim V'Shein Arba B'chutz. Because it's actually not our Mishnah. This is the Mishnah at the beginning of Shabbos, the first Mishnah that we questioned from. That Mishnah also implies that Achnasa is called Yitzios. Why? Because it says Yitzios Shabbos are two that are four Bifnim and Shtayim Shein Arba B'chutz. Become a Farish Achnasa. And then the Mishnah goes on to explain that what are the two that are four from outside? That you're bringing it inside. You bring it from the outside into the inside, and it calls it a Yitzia. Shema Minah. So we see it's called the Yitzio Shabbos, and it refers to Achnasa. Rava says no. The Tana gives a different explanation. Why is it called Yitzios in our case over here, even though it's dealing with Achnasos? So he says, Rava says that the word Yitzios here does not refer back to Achnasa and Otsa. It does not refer to taking it in as opposed to or taking it out. Reshuyos Katani. It says, when it says Yitzios, we should read it as there are two Reshuyos, there are two laws, there are two areas with respect to the laws of carrying on Shabbos, the private domain and the public domain. He says Yitzios Shabbos Shtayim Shein Arba. When he says the carryings out on Shabbos are two that are four, he doesn't mean the carrying out from the public domain, from the private domain to the public domain. He means Reshuyos Shtayim Shabbos Shtayim. He says that the domains of Shabbos are two that are four, meaning to say he's counting the two reshuyos, that there are four prohibitions associated with them. That's all he's saying. That's what Rava says. Usually the Gemara goes chronological order. Here, the answer of Rava Ashi is given before the answer of Rava, but that's because he's just responding to Abai. But then Rava came back and gave a totally different explanation. Well, I don't know that any of them are accepted. They're just trying to understand the Mishnah, but they're not. It's not halacha ma'isa. They're just. It's like. It's almost like an essay on language. Like we said, it's almost like trying to understand the wording of the Mishnah. Well, Rabbi's explanation is actually the most difficult because he's saying the word Yitzios does not mean what it means elsewhere in the context of discussion. In Shabbos, it means one thing, and here it means something else. In Shabbos, it means carrying in and carrying out, and here it means the domains of Shabbos are two with four prohibitions. Abai's answer is very simple. He says when it says Yitzios, Yitzios means carrying from the private domain to the public domain, but it also means carrying from the public domain into the private domain, because you take it out from one domain into another domain. Avai's explanation is much more in sync with the way we speak today, in my opinion. Okay, so now we're up to the next line of the Mishnah, which says Maros Negayim Shtayim Shein Arba, that the Saras is two, that is four. So Tanan Hasam, we learned, so there is a tractate called Negayim. So that's Mishnayos. Tanan Hasam, Maros Negayim, that the appearances of Negayim are Shnayim Shein Arba. There are two that are four. So what are the two that are four? So the Mishnah Negayim says, Baheret, remember we just read this on Shabbos, Baheres Sapachas Usei. So what does the Pasuk say? The Pasuk talks about a Baheres, which is one Saras, one appearance of Tzaras, and Se'if, which is another. Baheret is Tzaras that's Aza Kashalang, that's very white, strong like snow. And Shniela Kisira, and it's Tolda, meaning to say something that's also prohibited because it's a Baheres, but it's not directly Baheres. It's Tolda is like the white of a limestone. Ste'es, now the pasuk also refers to Ste'es. That's Ketzemer Lavan. That's like white wool. Shniela, and its tolada, its like derivative is kikrum beitza, like the white of an egg. So we have four whites. We have the white of snow white. We have limestone white. We have excuse me. We have the white of snow. We have limestone white. We have the white of wool, and we have the white of an egg. So Amar B'Chanina, Mantana Maros Negayim. Who is the author? Whoever is the author of this Mishnah in Negayim, the first Mishnah in Negayim, that author is not Rabbi Akiva, the local Rabbi Akiva. The Rabbi Akiva. So there's two basic laws about tzaras. One is that you need to get in order to be liable for or not be liable, in order to be considered tzaras, you need to have a tzaras mark that's the size of a grist. A grist usually translated as a bean is usually associated like the size of a dime, a coin, a dime or a penny. So we don't have pennies. So Maras Negayim the local Rabbi Akiva, and that's one law. Now, if it's the Av and the Tolda, the mark and its derivative, they could combine. But if it's not, the Av can't combine with different, like a different Tolda. The Baharis can't combine with the Tolda of Se'ez. Another law that we'll see from our Mishnah, and this is mostly on tomorrow's daf, is that the tzaras can combine. There's the different levels of white, and they can combine only with the one right above it or right below it, but not with one away. So we see Mount Tadamaris Negaim, the local Rabbi Akiva, the author of this Mishnah in Negaim cannot be like Rabbi Akiva. The Rabbi Akiva, Kivan Damar Zua Malamizu, the Zua Malamizu. Since Rabbi Akiva said that it can only combine with the one right above it, Imkain, Biharta Sid Hechol Milotzaref. Then, if that will be the case, there'll never be a case where if you see a marker that's the white of the limestone, it will never be able to combine. Why? Who's the white, the taras, that's the white of the limestone, which is a tolada of Bahares? Who is it going to combine with? Litrafe Bahade Bahares. It can combine with the Bahares. Why? Because Ikos the Eitz Dadifa, because the assumption is that the white of the snow is the highest form of white, and then the one that's right below it is the white of the wool, and then only below that is the white of the limestone, and only below that is the white of the egg. I assume this is the egg before it's cooked. It's not as white then. So ba'ade man litzfei ba'ade be'eretz ika seis dadifa minei. This seis is a brighter form than it. Litzfei ba'ade seis, and say, okay, let the white of the limestone combine with the seis. La'afto wada didei having. It's not its tolada. It's not its tolada. It can't combine with it. So the Gemara says, well, why are you asking about only the limestone? We have the same question about the white of the egg. Who's it going to combine with? If you want to combine with this ace, the white of the limestone is going to be whiter or brighter than the white of the egg. And litrafe bahade sid, you want to combine it to with the sid la barmineu. They're both different tolados of different ones. The sid is from the Baharis, and white of the egg, the krum the beitza, is with the se'es. So the Gemara says, well, that's not a question. Hi, Mai, that's not a question. Bishlam below sid hechol krum beitza. It's not. That's not a question. Bishlam below sid. Because without the white of the limestone, with Bishlam below Sid Hechol Krum Beitza Lokash, you can't ask a question from the Krum Beitza. Why? The Afagav the Krum Beitza Mitatar Deseis, because even though the white of the egg is two down from the seis, meaning to say we have the white of the limestone before the eight, so it's two down. Rahmana Amar v'laseis v'lisapachas. Sapachas feilis l'seis, meaning to say that the pasuk tells us v'laseis v'lisapachas. The word sapachas is like a descriptive. It's saying why is it under the seis to tell us this law. Afagav de menachta minei tuva, even though it's two below, that the white of the egg could combine with the white of the seis. Ella Sid Eichel Kasha. But we have the question: who is Sid able to combine with? It must be that El Machvarta Masnisin the local Rabbi Akiva. Must be that our Mishnah is not like Rabbi Akiva, because in the Mishnah it says that the Sid Eichel is a Tawad of Beharis, and according to Rabbi Akiva, Beharis has no Tawada, and space has two Tawadas: the Sid of the Eichel and the Krum of the Beitza. And so, therefore, we're going to learn where we learn this din of Rabbi Akiva in tomorrow's daf. A big shkoyach to everybody.